In a city where silence reigns supreme, where even the whisper of a voice is an act of rebellion, one man arrives with a question that will shatter everything. As Riven speaks for the first time, the city's tightly held secret begins to unravel, and with it, the silence that has kept its citizens imprisoned for centuries. What happens when the power of words is no longer forbidden? For as long as anyone could remember, the city had been silent. A sprawling metropolis built from towering steel and glass, its streets were filled with people who never spoke a word. No one needed to. They communicated with gestures, expressions, and the written word on their devices. Noise was considered a nuisance, an intrusion. The city had evolved beyond verbal communication, into a place where silence was not just a preference, but a law. The people of the city spoke only when necessary, and even then, their voices were barely above a whisper, a mere murmur of thought. Children learned from a young age that words were not to be uttered unless absolutely required, and even then, it was through hand signs or text on their screens. Life was orderly, peaceful, and quiet, until the day he arrived. The stranger Riven had heard rumors about the silent city. He had never intended to come here. His journey had taken him to strange places, but none quite like this. He had crossed miles of barren land, dense forests, and cities that hummed with the noise of life, only to find himself at the gates of a city where no sound reached his ears. The moment Riven stepped foot in the city, he noticed something different. The air was dense with an eerie stillness, as though the city itself was holding its breath. People moved along the streets with purpose, their faces emotionless, their hands quick in their gestures. He was the only one who spoke, his words falling to the ground, swallowed by the oppressive silence around him. He asked a man for directions to the town square. The man stared at him for a moment before slowly raising his hands, signing something Riven couldn't quite understand. He tried again, louder this time, asking about the place he was looking for. The man's face hardened slightly. He shook his head, turned, and walked away. Riven was undeterred. This was a city like no other, and he was determined to learn why. Breaking the silence. Riven's presence did not go unnoticed. A few curious glances followed him wherever he went, but no one approached. Days passed, and he came to realize that his words had begun to stir something in the city's pulse. The citizens, who once moved in perfect synchronization, now seemed slightly off, their movements a bit jerky, their eyes a little too wide. It wasn't until Riven stumbled into a small cafe on the edge of the city that he found someone willing to break the silence. A woman named Maris, who appeared in her early 30s, stood behind the counter. She was the first person who dared to speak aloud, though her voice barely rose above a whisper. "You're new here," she said, watching him intently. "No one comes here by accident." Riven raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "I'm looking for answers," he said, his voice echoing in the quiet room. Maris nodded, though her expression remained unreadable. "I thought so." She moved closer, her eyes darting around to make sure no one was watching. "You should be careful. They don't like it when people speak. It disrupts things." Who doesn't like it?" Riven asked, his frustration bubbling up. "People here are afraid of the truth," she said, "afraid of their own voices. There's a reason no one speaks, and it's buried deep within the city's foundation." Riven's curiosity only deepened. He needed to know what she meant. What's buried beneath the city? Maris hesitated before answering, glancing nervously around the room. "A secret," she whispered. "Something that no one dares to acknowledge. If you keep speaking, if you keep asking questions, you'll find it." The silence was not just an absence of sound. It was a presence, an oppressive force that clung to everything. It settled in the air, thick like fog, and wrapped itself around every thought, every gesture. People moved in rhythm, as if synchronized by a force beyond their control, each step taken in careful calculation to avoid disturbing the stillness. But beneath it all, there was an unspoken tension, a quiet desperation that simmered just below the surface. The more Riven wandered, the more he could feel it. This city had been silenced for a reason, and that reason wasn't just to keep order. It was to suppress something far more dangerous. There was power in voices, in the act of speaking truths and asking questions. And the longer he stayed, the more he realized that this quiet, this eerie calm, was a prison, one that had been built with far more purpose than anyone had ever been willing to acknowledge. Chapter 3. The Truth Beneath. The next day, Riven found himself wandering through the heart of the city, his mind racing. Something was wrong, but he couldn't put his finger on it. The silence wasn't just a choice. It was an oppression, a force that controlled the city in ways that went beyond simple custom. As he ventured deeper into the city's lower levels, he discovered signs of something strange. Flickering lights, half-washed symbols on walls, doors that seemed to lead nowhere, and corridors that twisted unnaturally. There was a sense of decay here, of something hidden just beneath the surface. His footsteps echoed off the walls of an ancient underground chamber. At the far end of the chamber, he found an old console, half buried under rubble. It hummed with a faint, eerie power. As he approached, a holographic image flickered to life before him, displaying a series of cryptic symbols. Suddenly, a voice rang out, loud and clear in the silence. "Leave!" Riven spun around, heart pounding, to see a man standing at the entrance of the chamber, his face masked in shadow. "What is this place?" Riven asked, his voice louder now. He had no intention of backing down. The figure stepped forward. "This is where it all began," he said, his voice gravelly. "A long time ago, the city was like any other, filled with noise, chaos, life. But the council, the architects of this place, realized that silence would give them power. They imposed a curse, binding the voices of the citizens. The more they spoke, the more they drew attention to the truth. And that truth was dangerous." "The truth about what?" Riven demanded. The figure's eyes flickered with something like sorrow. "The truth that the city was built on lies. Lies that were meant to protect the powerful and silence the rest. The people, they didn't have a choice. They were forced to forget their voices, forced to forget their power." Riven stepped closer, his hands trembling. "And now, the silence controls them all?" "Yes," the figure replied. "And it's been like this for centuries. But now, your voice, it's unraveling everything." The days that followed were filled with unrest. More and more people began to speak, slowly at first, then in hushed murmurs, and finally in defiant declarations. Riven had unwittingly become the spark that reignited their voices, and now the city was on the brink of a new revolution. Maris found Riven again in the midst of the growing chaos. "You've done it," she said, her voice shaking with fear and excitement. "The people are waking up, but they'll never let us leave now. The council will do anything to protect their secret." Riven nodded, his resolve hardening. "Then we fight." The people who had long been silenced now stood together, united by a newfound power, the power of their voices. They stormed the council's headquarters, demanding the truth be revealed. In the heart of the city, the great bell tower rang out for the first time in centuries, its clang reverberating through the streets like a call to arms. Chapter 5. The Collapse. As the council's grip on the city crumbled, Riven and Maris descended into the deepest levels of the city, where the true heart of the silence lay. There, they discovered the core, a machine, ancient and massive, pulsing with dark energy. The truth was clear now. The city's silence wasn't a choice. It was a prison built on a machine that suppressed the voices of its people. The council had used the machine to maintain control, using fear and manipulation to keep the truth buried. Riven knew what had to be done. He turned to Maris, his expression resolute. "We end this. Now." With a single push of a button, the machine hummed and then went quiet. The silence, for the first time in centuries, was broken. The city erupted into sound, laughter, shouting, crying, the roar of freedom. and for the first time, the people of the Silent City could finally speak. As the last of the council's control crumbled, the city that had once been bound by silence began to hum with the sounds of freedom. The first full, unrestrained laugh echoed through the streets, followed by the voices of children, who had never known anything but quiet, now shouting in joy and wonder. Riven stood at the heart of it all, watching the transformation with a sense of awe. He had come to this place as an outsider, a stranger in a world where words were weaponized and truth had been buried. But now, as the city slowly rebuilt itself, its foundation not just of stone, but of hope and truth, he understood. Silence may have kept them in line, but it was their voices that would carry them forward. Maris, standing beside him, smiled for the first time without hesitation. "We've done it," she whispered. "We've freed them." Riven nodded, but his heart was no longer heavy with the burden of his mission. The fight was over, but the work had just begun. A new chapter was unfolding, not just for the city, but for every soul who had once been silenced. And as the sun set behind the city's towering skyline, it wasn't just the promise of a new day that lingered in the air. It was the power of voices, united in truth and strength. This was only the beginning.